Welcome to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Ado. This is the thought leadership show that brings you insights from the experiences of men and women who have done great exploits both here at home and around the world. This is the show that ensures we're leading thought and engendering positive action. Today, we're joined by a man who is a chartered accountant, an international development practitioner, and an author, Marricke Kofi Gane. Welcome to the Executive Lounge.
Thank you, Inshira.
Good to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
Let's get to know who Marricke Kofi Gane is.
Marricke, you've already said it. I'm a chartered accountant. I practice international development, and I also author. Beyond that, I just love my country, Ghana. I'm a father of four, and I love the youth. And most of the things I do have been around the youth. But international development, most of my work has been around violent, conflicted countries and international aid throughout the world for the British government and other governments.
Fantastic stuff. Let's learn a bit about you as a child, or as the younger Marricke.
Right. So I was originally Charles, eventually changed the name to Marricke. I'm the third of four children, 2 boys and 2 girls. My parents are both still alive. I grew up in a lot of places. I grew up in Liberia, Nigeria, and then Ghana.
Wow.
Because my dad ran around a lot, so I was the one with him. But I spent a lot of my childhood in Keta, where I went to primary school, and then we went off to Liberia. I came back and went to secondary school, then we went off to Nigeria, and then I came back, and then I started my ACCA, and then left off to the UK. But my childhood has been fun because it was by the beachside in Keta, on a coconut plantation with my grandparents. So yeah, it was lovely. Back in the days, you know, they saw it as just a basic way of life. Growing up, I found that was actually a luxury than it is basic, because we don't have that kind of life anymore. You can't go into a community where you live very nicely by the beachside, eat seafood from the sea and the lagoon, and drink coconut water. That, for me, now is a luxury. Back then, it was just a normal way of life, but that has been my childhood.
Wow, I'm sure you miss it.
I miss the coconut water. I miss the coconut water. I apparently have become fond of seafood, so I'm a seafood addict. But I think that was because of where I grew up, and I do miss it. I miss it a lot. Right.
Yeah. Now, so as an author and someone with a passion for youth, what do you find yourself writing a lot about?
I write what I'm inspired by at any point in time. So I've got 11 books so far. Some of them are professionally oriented. One in the practice of international development finance, which is not in the mainstream because it's quite specialized. I've written quite a few on how the young can find their calling. So that particular one, for example, has been a bridge between putting Christianity together with real-world ways of trying to find where you belong in the world and trying to pick it and run. My last 2 books, actually I wrote a book on Africa, and the question posed was, why is Africa what it is? So that is also there. And then there's 2 books which I recently wrote. One is the Marricke Chronicles, which you're aware of.
That's right.
And then the last one was the Afro-London Wahala. That I wrote because I was leaving London, relocating back to Ghana. And I thought I needed something to tell my story of how things were back in the UK when I first went, and then my stay there until I left. But my favorite has been the Marricke Chronicles, and another one called Doing Business with God.
Yeah, I know that book.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the Chronicles, especially, what about it excites you?
The Chronicles sort of captures my vision for Ghana. So I wrote that book. I took a year off from work without pay and did a bit of research. But only at the time that was how madly passionate I was. So I took a bit of time off, did some research and wrote the book. Now, a lot of people who read the books ask me, is it my manifesto? It almost seems as though it is the manifesto. But I think I have been fortunate to have traveled around a lot, worked with a lot of governments, the good ones and the not so good ones, being in a lot of environments where it's great and it's not so great. And so when I come back to Ghana, and I do come back to Ghana a lot back then, when I come back to Ghana, I ask myself, you know, we don't have an awful lot of this advantage that the other countries I've been in have. And if we compare ourselves to those countries that are doing well, we seem to have more than they actually started off with. And so the question keeps knowing, why aren't we where they are? And that was what's inspired me to write that book. So it is a book that captures various changes that I feel need to be made in the various sectors of our country. It covers everything: youth, economics, you know, employment, you know, the judiciary, everything, you name it, tourism, it's all in there. And it's really just a capture of what I think is the way forward. Why it is being inspirational for me is that after I wrote it about 3 years ago, and it's still relevant. It's still very relevant. So, yeah.
You have some interesting thoughts in that book, and we'll explore some of them a little later. But you also quite, one of the words, or you know, that I've heard you use quite often in your writing, is critical thinking.
Critical thinking, right.
Help us understand what you mean, your context of critical thinking. What is it about?
Right. So critical thinking is a combination of three kinds of thinking. Quick thinking, which basically is about you being able to think on your feet, because situations arise very suddenly. You need to think on your feet. That's one. Then there's also analytical thinking, which really is about, for every situation we face, trying to find out what the real core problem is, because we never so much see the real problem as we do the symptoms. So normally we see the symptoms, but analytical thinking is about having a structured way of trying to dig out what the real problems are in spite of the symptoms that we see. So that's two. And then the other angle to critical thinking, which most people don't put together, is creative thinking. Which is to say, okay, you've solved the problem, you know, quite immediately, you know, temporarily. You've gone down to the bottom to find out what the problem is. And now creative thinking allows you to explore what solutions there are. They may not be the right solutions at the time. They may be very crazy solutions, but they are solutions that think about the now, the past, and the future. Now, if you put it in context, the world, there's three things that seem to define the world these days: speed, complexity, and the fact that things just happen, you know, and you're not quite ready for those. Now, these three different forms of thinking match all these three forms that we see the world shaping up to now.
Okay.
So it is essential that we engage critical thinking in the way whether it's an individual or a business or a country. That's my view of what critical thinking.
Where will you put the concept or the practice of critical thinking in the space of development?
In the space of development, see, that cuts across now, because if let's take a government, for example. Let's assume a government was beginning to think, you know what, how are we looking at our economy? How are we looking at school? How are we looking at tourism? Anything of that nature. The question we need to be asking ourselves is this. Okay, let's take education, for example. Where are we at now? Let's compare ourselves to the world. Where are we at now? Okay, so we know where we are. We're not that great. We're not that very well at the bottom. We know that we're just in the middle somewhere. Where do we want to be? We want to be up there. Okay. What are the reasons why we're not where we're supposed to be? That's when analytical thinking comes into the picture, because now you're going to dissect your whole educational system and ask the questions around curriculum, how it is structured. You want to ask questions about how teachers are being taught themselves how to teach. And the questions around that will be, for example, are they using the right teaching techniques? Because there are scientifically proven techniques that ensure that learning is absorbed quicker than others. And you're thinking about things around the infrastructure of education, for example. Now, that is analytical thinking. So you sort of dissect the whole educational system into little bits. And for each of those little bits, you try to find out what exactly is the reason why we're not where we are. Now, once you figure that out, then you move on to the phase of creative thinking, where you put everybody at a table and say, look, you may not have an idea in education, but your knowledge is needed. Because sometimes the truth about creative thinking is this: it sometimes takes people outside the specific sphere you're dealing with to come up with some really radical ideas. And for where Ghana is now, I do think we need some really, really radical ideas. So that is creative thinking. And it is putting these things together that ensures that for every level of development we want to engage in. Let me give you an example. We're talking about education, right? Let me give you an example. The bulk of our curriculum was set up during the start of independence, Kwame Nkrumah's time and all that. It was built on the foundation of our colonial masters who came over and did what they had to do, and then they started schooling a few of our folks. So now, the reason why they were schooling our folks was not to make us become the masters or the managers. They were schooling us so that we can align with their agenda to come in here, cut the log, you know, dig out the gold and plug everything else and ship over. That was the agenda. When we took over, the question I don't think we really asked was, this foundation we are about to build our education on, is it aligned to our vision? And whether we need to change it. I don't think it was. And the reason why I don't think it was is all you have to do is to look at our educational curriculum and you realize one blaring truth. Our curriculum does not teach us how to think, it teaches us what to think. And there's a fundamental difference around that. Because if you teach somebody to think, you are teaching them how to think quickly, you are teaching them how to think analytically, you are teaching them how to think creatively. We don't have that, okay? That's on the curriculum side. You take the teachers, for example. The question we need to be asking teachers, for example, in our educational system is, what is their singular mandate? Are they being mandated to position our graduates in the future? Or they are being taught to let our graduates function in the now? The world has changed. It takes people who can locate the future and position themselves to be the leaders of the world. This is a program about thought leadership.
That's right.
Our students need to be positioning in the future. They need to be seeing problems and getting solutions to those problems before Nigeria, before Niger, before Cameroon even recognizes that there are problems in Africa like that. That's how we become leaders. Then you take the educational infrastructure, for example. Our educational infrastructure is not at the level where students get out of it and immediately are aligned to any other country's infrastructure in the world. We come out of education and the structures that are there do not allow us to become global citizens. It's not right. People make the mistake of thinking you need to travel to be a global citizen. You don't need to travel to be a global citizen.
Well, it's actually smaller now.
Smaller, much, much smaller. Okay, I was in Singapore. The kids there use tablets. Their teacher uses a board that has Skype and all that. Okay, those kids leave that classroom knowing that it's not that difficult to connect with the rest of the world. Our students don't leave primary school, they leave tertiary school, and they now have to learn how even Google works. And that's a fundamental difference, totally fundamental difference. So this whole thing...
Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Ado, and my guest, Marricke Kofi Gane. He's an author, a chartered accountant, and an international development practitioner. Marricke, mindset.
Mindset.
Yes. Now, the world over, lots of people will say that, look, and I've forgotten the author of this book, but Why Countries Fail.
Right.
You know, there's this theory.
Yes.
That the countries that don't do well are no different from the other countries. I mean, yes, we may be of a different persuasion in terms of our race, but it doesn't make us less, because we have people of our ilk who are doing well elsewhere around the world. Right. But Africa is singled out for having this challenge that has to do with the mindset that drives everything we do, the decisions we take, and even how we look at past experiences and things like that. How do you take that theory, or rather, what do you make of that theory?
That is it's a 20 question at the same time, a very, very relevant one. Mindset, I think what is required in our environment really is, I like to say, self-government, where, I mean, I could list a lot of you know, values that I think would necessarily help us get there. You know, I could say pride in country, and therefore you're prideful, you advertise your country wherever you go, you're very full on about your country wherever you are. I could list responsibility, which is to say you don't share responsibility, you always make sure if it's in your court you get it done. There's several things I could say, but when I look at these things, it all comes down to self-government. And self-government in the sense that we should have a structured way of ensuring that we as individuals are able to govern ourselves. So in a sense, our mind as individuals become our government, and the rest of our bodies and the way we behave become our subjects. And the question we should be asking at every point in time is, if I was the government, what would I require the rest of myself to do? If we can psych ourselves up that way, then a lot can get achieved. Now, having said that, we are humans. And like you said, our natural dispensation as Africans might be different from the dispensation of other races and other countries and all that. What I do think would work in our kind of environment is to ensure that we have structured ways of behavior.
Structured ways of behavior?
Structured ways of behavior.
Help me appreciate that.
Structured ways of behavior in the sense that we have laws. The laws are there because they're supposed to make our countries better. We need to enforce those laws, which is what has largely been missing. It's not that we don't have the laws, it's not that we don't have the regulations or the statutes and all that. The problem has been we're not disciplined enough to enforce those laws. Because you see, when you start enforcing those laws, what tends to happen is that even the man on the street who doesn't like being self-governed begins to be forced by the laws to self-govern until it becomes a natural phenomenon for him. And then from that point on, you don't really need to whack him with a stick or with a carrot and say, you know, this is the way you're supposed to do things. The system ensures that he learns to become a natural self-governor. So, you know, we could talk about this, but I really think our problem is we need to enforce the laws we have. We have fantastic laws.
As do the other territories you've experienced
and
worked
most
in.
of those laws are at par with the other territories.
Why are they able to scale the trajectory of growth and development faster than we have?
Because things work. Things work at the top.
So how do we make things work here?
Things have to work at the top, Mishra. I mean, you and I are sitting here, right?
Mm-hmm.
The head, and I have a lot of debates around this, but the head has to be disciplined enough because the head controls everything. The head has to be disciplined enough for the rest of the body to follow. Mm. And, you know, as much as we may dangle it around and, you know, slice it around, and it doesn't get any more straightforward than that. So
in the context of what your vision for Ghana would be, I mean, if you had a blank canvas, right, and you had to paint the Ghana that you would like, how would you like that Ghana to be? What are the elements that you'd want to see in the head and the body?
Oh, that's very easy. That's very easy. I would like to see a politics that we do in this country that is not filled with... I want to see the best of minds in this country in politics. Because then you have the best leading the rest. And it doesn't have any further effect than to make the rest become the best. It's really that simple. It's not that difficult. Excuse me to say this, but we don't want dining hall prefects in parliament. I want somebody who is highly intelligent, extremely intelligent, sitting in parliament, because I know that person can project himself into the future and see what is about to happen and make laws that ensure that we're already there.
But you're not suggesting that a dining hall prefect is not someone who's...
I'm not suggesting that.
Okay, so...
I'm just suggesting we need more dynamic people.
Your achievement should be beyond that.
It should be much, much beyond that. I mean, you don't need to be a highly educated person, okay? I've seen people who are, you know, who I've come across that don't have any qualifications at all. But they're able to project themselves. And I think that's very critical. We need people who are able to project themselves into various elements of the country and see the bigger picture. I think it's the whole need to see the bigger picture. That's what I would like for politics. And then you talk about the other sectors, you know.
Let's take education, for example.
Education is easy. I'd like to see an education where the curriculum, the training of teachers, and the infrastructure, all these three align to ensure that our graduates are positioned in the future. They need to be in the future. They need to be where nobody else is. Their minds need to be there. They need to be thinking what problems are going to happen in the future and start creating solutions for them before everybody else gets there. That's the only way we can bridge the gap between where we're supposed to be and where we've been in the last 60 plus years. That's education. Take economics, for example. I'd like to see a Ghana where we come to a point where we can recognize that, look, we've been mining gold for 60 plus years. We've been planting cocoa, and we don't have any control over the amount of them that get bought on the international market. We don't have any control over their prices. I want to see an economy that enforces the need to start thinking about how to evolve new economies. And it is possible. I was in London when the whole, call it the square mile IT boom happened. Okay, it's just a square mile that they put together, and a whole revolution started in technology. The UK now it's always been a mined economy, but it's now become a very strong IT economy. Exactly when we went through a dip, you know. So economies are able to be built from scratch these days. And we need to start thinking that, because we won't be relying on gold forever. We won't be relying on cocoa forever. You know, now we talk about bauxite, but it's not always going to be there. And so we need to start finding ways of evolving new economies. And I have a few thoughts in my mind, but none of which I can share on the show.
Well, we hear that. I'll find a way to pry that out of you. But I mean, you raised some very compelling points. For example, the diversification of the economy.
Yeah.
The fact that we ought to start looking at new ways of creating layers of growth. And I hear you on that. Haven't we been trying to do that for some time? What are we getting wrong?
Well, here is the thing, for example. I mean, in the last 5 years, we used to have a Greek leading the contribution to GDP. It slipped down about 7 years ago, okay, without any major help. The services industry has taken lead consistently, at least in the last 5 years, without any major input, you know, from government or, right. The question we should be asking ourselves is, why is that happening? And that's already a trend we can start riding, okay? I would have thought we would look at that and say, hey, hold on here. The services industry, without any major input, seems to be riding a high tide here. What is happening there? How can we make sure that even gets to bloom further, all right? And that's what we need to be doing. We have a lot of banks here. The banks are not going to sustain because the economy itself is not big enough for the number of banks we have. What we should be looking at is whether we can start developing a knowledge economy. And very easily so. Very easily so. We speak better English than the Indians, but the Indians have a lot of, I'm not saying this thing shouldn't move to India, but we have call centers in India, for example. We speak, you know. So we have people who are starting to get into the whole frenzy of information technology. That is probably the easiest economy that we can create from ground up. I don't see why we are not doing that. I don't see why we are not doing that.
In your chronicles, you talked about change, and I think change is a constant because things are happening at, you know, lightning speed.
That's right.
And the only thing you need to do or can do is to quickly adapt.
True. Or die.
True. You know, which itself is some kind of a change, albeit permanent one.
True.
But the thing is this, that in the chronicles, you did talk about a concept, the things that you felt that if we're going to see some real development, the certain changes that we needed to we have a 50-year development plan. What's the place of a development plan?
It's in good place.
It's a good thing.
It's a good thing to have. I don't see why not. It's a really good thing to have.
But there's nothing that binds anybody.
That is where it falls apart. That is where it falls apart. I've always said, you know, let's take this 50-year development plan, okay? Let's see which elements of that plan for our development is critical. Let's take those critical elements. If it's about building a road, and I've always said that, if it's about building a road from here, a straight four-lane road from here all the way straight to the north, let's do that. Now, let's take the critical components of that 50-year development plan. Let's build a shield around it. And by a shield, that means let's have a constitutional ring around it to say, irrespective of the government that comes into power, there are some elements of this plan that they have to do. Take the National Crossrail in the UK, for example. It didn't matter whether it was Labour that introduced it or that the Conservatives came back later. It is a national agenda. And so, you know, irrespective of whichever government comes into power, it has to be done. That's the kind of thing we need to do. And then ring fence it also with financing so that this government doesn't come in and say, you know what, we didn't start that, so it's not our priority. That is not development. So you find out that we have a national, you know, 10-year, it could be even 20 years, 50-year development plan. Unfortunately, everything is lumped up into one big basket, and it is at the mercy of politicians whether they want to follow it or not. Because mind you, politicians will always go for what is the manifesto agenda.
And we hoping against hope and possibly staring down an abyss, especially that the politicians are the ones who can effect the change that you're talking about.
They are.
But how will we make them do?
I mean, it's you see, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, civil engagement happening these days. I mean, all it just takes is to have the citizens upset about something and they can push things to get done. I don't see why we can't push for this to get done. I think we should be pushing for things that are development-centered to be done. For example, this. I mean, rightly so, we should have a constitutional agenda on this. There are elements of that 50-year plan, and I must congratulate the team that worked on that. There are elements on there that are brilliant, that I think should be ring-fenced by the Constitution, should be ring-fenced by Parliament, should be ring-fenced with financing, so that, you know, we know for a fact that at least in the next 10 years we will get somewhere, because no politician can stop us from getting there. And I think that's the fundamental difference between...
Isn't our politics a reflection, or aren't we a microcosm of the politics that we do? That the typical Ghanaian would like to start a business and be the sole owner of that business. And so we are not interested in, you know, let's build a legacy together and hand it off to someone.
I mean, you're right. I mean, I think it's the way politics has been done for so long, which is that if I come into power, I have to, in order to look good, condemn everything you have done in order for me to look good. If we can change that, and I think there's a lot of new people going into politics these days, and hopefully that gets to change.
Is that a critical mass that can effect the change?
I think we do need a critical mass.
So we don't have it now?
I think it's gathering. I don't think we have it. I think it's gathering because there's a lot of beautiful things that are happening now. Women are becoming more vocal. We're having a larger population of youth, and the middle, you know, the middle belt folks are also becoming a bit more assertive in that sense. So it is building. I think what everybody seems to be waiting for is there going to be a different kind of cloud that says, you know what, we want to do things differently. I think that seems to be, you know, because everybody seems to be fed up with the way things have been for this long.
Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Addo, and my guest, Marricke Kofi Gane. Now, Marricke, just before we went to the break, I did say I want to pick your brains on the experiences that you've had around the world. What are the telltale signs of a government that will do well, or a people that will do well, especially coming out of conflict? Now, Ghana hasn't been through that,
yes,
you know, but maybe our conflict is a conflict of, you know, identity and inferiority complex.
Right.
So, what are the things we ought to do from the places you've been? Be it value systems that we need to cultivate, or systems we need to put in place to regulate how we do things. What are the things we need to do to really develop?
To really develop, wow, that's a huge order. I mean, I think we are developing, just not as much. I generally think the current government has got quite a number of things right. There are still some things to do. I do think, and I mentioned this earlier, I do think, I mean, you hear people in Ghanaians a lot talking about the systems need to work. Not that the systems are not there. So I think the systems are there.
Okay.
The question is, how do we make them work? And that cuts across for, and I say this, the systems are there to enforce all the tenets of development that we talk about. So accountability, you know, the rule of law, you name them, okay? The systems are there, the laws are there, the institutions are there. The question is, why aren't they working? There's a human resource element in there, which largely is about, I know I spoke earlier about saying we want the very sharpest people in the right positions, okay? So there's a huge human resource element in there, which is that we need to assign the right people to the right institutions. That's the only way they're going to work. Because, I mean, these institutions don't run themselves. So there's that element, okay? The other element is that we need to be sharp on technology. And I say that for a reason. A lot of our institutions were set up during our independence. The Ghanaian people have evolved. The environment in which Ghana finds itself, whether it's in Africa or dealing with international communities, has very vastly evolved. The question that we've never really asked is, do our systems, are they alive enough to deal with these major changes? The truth is they are not. And so the human resource elements need to change. We need to bring in the sharpest of our minds that we have, people who can figure out what is happening now, and most crucially, I say, and what is about to happen. And I can't stress that enough. It's the only way we can be ahead of the game, whether locally or internationally. The systems, we talk about technology, the technologies need to be in place. See, when those systems were set up, you know, Ghana was just about, what, 6 million or so? It was easy to cope, okay? The population is almost, what, quadrupled, okay? The complexities of the demands of the citizens has changed. The complexities and demands of how our governments deal with other governments have changed. The requirements of, you know, the UN, the OAU, everything we are part of have changed. Our systems are struggling because we've not updated them enough to be able to deal with those. I'll give you an example. It's only recently that, you know, when I felt this was a bit of a bright light for me. The current government had a Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation. Most of our ministries were never really equipped to be able to gather data. And you and I know, we've even moved from the stage of data availability to big data now, which means that data is actually over available, and we are being able to now use that to predict what the future is going to have, okay, or happen. We can't do that because we've never been data sensitized. Our institutions have never been data sensitized. So we need that kind of modernization. And it is not about just buying computers. It isn't. It's about structuring ourselves to figure out what we need to be using for decision making. And that's another element that is a problem, you know, the skill set. Okay.
To be able to mine the data and
use it. And utilize it. So you realize that if we can get, look, these are very basic things. Get a human resource in right, get a technology in right, and get a decision-making procedures right.
Let's take the human resource element and just deal with that for a moment. We have a largely ill-educated, poorly resourced population. How are we going to fix the human resource element if we have a system that's not churning out the best?
Well,
unless you're talking repatriation. do we do a global repatriation of Ghanaian brains?
Well, I mean, we have had brain drains in the past. We might as well start trying to intentionally create a brain gain. You know, everybody talks about the Singaporeans, but one thing the Singaporeans did that we never really captured, it's not really captured, is that when they came on the scene after they split from Malaysia and all that, the first thing they did was to carry out a human resource audit and ask themselves, you know, this is where we want to be in 20 years' time. What kind of resources do we need to get there? All right. They found that out, and then they shipped all those guys out and made a deal with them. You know, we'll train you, we'll pay everything. You go learn, do the best you can, and come back and serve. And so eventually they came back to serve, but they didn't only come back to serve, they began to multiply themselves pretty much. I don't think we totally have no human resource, right human resource for our institutions. I just think we need to be able to come to a point where we separate the politics of gaining power from the business of running public institutions.
How do you do that? How do you separate?
Very easy, Inshira, and I think we both know that.
No, but you see, let's look back at our history from 1992. I mean, we've had currently we have an MPP government. So we've had 2 terms of MPP, a 3rd term. We also had, so essentially we've had equal
Pretty much.
Up to the end of this term.
Yes.
But it's been the same.
It's been the same because, again, we go back to our politics. Our politics requires that we put people in positions who have either been party members or have made the loudest noise during our campaigns or are affiliated to the big players in the party. It's never really been meritorious.
But it's about no contribution, no chop. It's actually a very simple Ghanaian
But that's
balance,
why the cycle keeps going back and forth. You know, politicians can win and not necessarily have to be in the positions of running institutions. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. People can concentrate on their politics and enjoy politics without necessarily. And I think for me, it's this whole. There's a drag on our political system based on who contributed what. And so you find that it's as though people want to become ministers or are made to become ministers so they can protect their interests. There's two different things. So there's always the politics of, you know, winning power, and there's always the business. And there's two. And once you combine or you make the politics swallow the business of running the state, then you've messed it up. And that is why several times you have heard me say, you know, we don't really run a political democracy. We don't. We are running a business institution for the politicians, really.
Wow. So, a lot of people talk about Rwanda and how Rwanda is the new shining light on the continent.
Right.
Is
it?
Paul Kagame.
He's done well. No, he's done well.
You know, he's singled out as a bright guy. But there are other people who don't, you know, of course, would say otherwise.
Mm.
But if you look at the doing business index and things like that, they're way up there.
True.
How can Ghana replicate or even leapfrog something like that? Do we need a strong man?
Well, no, we don't need a strong man. That sounds like Obama. We need strong institutions. So we need, but I think, tell you something remarkable that Paul Kagame did. Yeah, and let's face fact. Okay, Ghana has been getting aid for longer than Rwanda has. Most of the money Rwanda has used to get to where it's gotten to is aid. Mm. Okay, it's about focus. It's about alignment. It's about focus. It really is about focus. It's about focus. Let's not also forget that Kagame has been there long enough, and so has had the time to implement what he's been focused on. And Kagame is disciplined. I've crossed paths with him. He is an extremely disciplined. Forget about the fact that he used to be a soldier and all that, but he is extremely disciplined. And I think disciplined to the point that, you know, if you're working under him, you can mess up because you're highly accountable. It's almost regimental in that respect. So we don't have to do anything different. We just need to pick X, Y, Z and say, you know what, as a country, this is what we want to focus on. And then pull all the grounds and focus on that. And by focus, I mean the government should be able to, and a lot of countries do this, the government should be able to say to donors, you know what, these are our priority areas for the next 10 years. It doesn't matter which government comes into power. So if you want to contribute to us, focus on these priority areas. That stops every donor from coming into the country and doing what it wants to do. And therefore, you know, results are scattered, nothing is focused, and so results are not being achieved. That's one side. The government should be able to gather the business community and say, you know what, we're focusing on A, B, and C. You either all line up or shut down. And I think the government has that leverage. You know, I think these things need to be done. So in a sense, we do need a bit of a strong man.
Right. In 2018 now,
Yeah,
2017. Okay, so in about 12 years or 13 years, Africa's population might just double. We'll have a larger youthful population.
Right.
What should the Ghanaian youth be doing today, and what kind of focus should we give to the Ghanaian youth?
That's so. What kind of focus should we give in the? Well, I mean, we should be equipping. You see, it's not easy to spot this thing. We should be able to know by now where the world is heading. The technology is not going to stop. It is not. If it stops, the world will shut down. So we know technology is going to be a big thing for the next another 50 or so years. Africa is highly deficient in that area. And that for us should be a happy, merry song we should be singing, because we could actually position our youth to be the leaders in that department. And out of that, you could literally be creating a whole new economy for Africa, right here from Ghana. And for me, that is what it means to be the shining light, is to look at where the holes are in our continent and say, you know what, our youth can plug into that and be the leader in that. And once you become a leader in a certain field, okay, you either block away the competition or you literally, and this is a funny thing I find about having a knowledge economy. It's the only economy that the longer it grows and evolves, the better it becomes. You dig gold, gold gets finished. You pluck cocoa from the trees, it gets finished. You build a knowledge economy, the economy just gets bigger, because the more you use the brain, the more it becomes better. It's really that, it's not a science, if you get what I mean. So I think it's easy to plug our youth into the knowledge economy, into the technological economy. Technology should be permeating every single thing we do at the universities by this point. Every single thing.
Technology. It's never going to stop.
It won't stop. It's only getting faster. It's only getting more complex. It's only getting more unpredictable.
Well, all too soon, we've come to the end of conversation. This is all time would allow, but it's been a fantastic and engaging conversation, Marricke, and good to have you on the show.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
We have a simple tradition on the Executive Lounge, and I'm going to share with you 5 things I'm taking away from this conversation. The very first one is pride. Pride. It's not the kind of pride that you call arrogant, but believing in something, wearing it on your sleeve, and carrying it with you, being about it. Marricke is proudly Ghanaian, and you know, everything he's done is about becoming that Ghanaian of excellence. And number 2 is that you have to have focus, and you should decide the critical things you want for where you want to be and go at them. And discipline. He kept saying that it has to be at the top. The man at the top. Your brain is at the top for a reason. It's in your head. And so self-governance is going to start when you discipline yourself. Then the rest of your body can follow. So if you find yourself in business, at home, or in political leadership, remember that you must govern yourself first, and the rest will follow. Number 4 is that we must remember the role of technology. We should be able to see the things before they even happen. We should be ready for tomorrow. In fact, we should be ready for next year today. Don't wait for it to happen. Because if you're ahead of the pack, your reaction time would be better. It means you will have the better spoils of all of this. And finally, that we will have a lot more youth than we do now in about 13 years. What are you doing to contribute to ensuring that they are ready to lead the world? Find a young person, mentor them, put some wisdom in their life, impart something you've learned in them, engage them, guide them, and encourage them, empower them to be great. We hope that this has been a time of shaping your thinking, and more importantly, engendering some positive action. My name is Inshirado. As always, go forward, make rain. Shalom.